You step into a thin nylon shelter as the storm builds outside. At first, it feels manageable. Just wind, just cold air pressing against fabric. But within minutes, something shifts. The temperature drops in a way that feels unnatural, like the air itself is being drained of warmth. Outside, a blizzard is forming a moving wall of white. Wind speeds climb hard enough to shake the entire structure. Snow doesn't fall gently here. It hits sideways, like sand in a storm. And if you were in this situation, there's no building, no heater, no backup system, just a tent separating you from conditions that can turn deadly in hours. Here's the part that doesn't make sense at first. People do survive nights like this. Not in shelters, not in rescue stations, but in setups that look almost too simple to work. Fabric walls, cheap insulation, improvised barriers, and yet they wake up alive. So the real question isn't how extreme the storm is. It's how anything at all is stopping it from taking everything from you. Because in a setup like this, the danger isn't just cold air. It's the speed at which your body loses heat without you noticing it happening. 1 hour feels fine. 2 hours feels colder. Then suddenly, your system is no longer adapting. It's failing quietly. And what makes it worse is how normal everything still looks from the inside. No alarms. No obvious collapse. Just a slow shift from uncomfortable to critical. So if you were inside this tent right now, surrounded by whiteout conditions, the question becomes unavoidable. What is actually keeping you alive in here? And what part of your setup is silently working against you? The real danger in a blizzard isn't the cold you can feel. It's the forces working on you that you stop noticing until your body starts shutting down. Most people think survival is about temperature. It isn't. It's about what steals your heat faster than you can replace it. The first enemy is wind, not as a background detail, as an active force that strips warmth from your body layer by layer. Inside a tent, wind doesn't just pass by. It presses, pulls, and destabilizes everything you're trying to protect. The moment air moves, it multiplies heat loss. A still cold night is manageable. A moving cold system becomes aggressive. Here's the thing. Your tent doesn't stop wind. It negotiates with it. And wind usually wins. The second enemy is moisture. This is the silent failure most people underestimate. Every breath you exhale carries heat and water vapor. In a sealed space, that vapor has nowhere to go. It condenses on fabric, turns to frost, and slowly spreads like an invisible freeze layer. At first, it feels harmless. Damp fabric, slight chill, then it compounds. Wet surfaces stop insulating. Instead, they start pulling heat directly from your body. What was protection becomes a heat drain. And the most deceptive part? You create it yourself just by staying alive. Then there is the third enemy, the one nobody respects until it's too late. The tent itself. It looks like shelter. But structurally, it behaves more like a thin membrane between survival and exposure. Most basic tents are not built to hold heat. They are built to block visibility and reduce wind exposure slightly. That's it. The fabric stretches, flaps, and flexes under pressure. Every movement of air outside translates into vibration inside. That vibration breaks whatever small thermal stability you had built. And here's the hidden truth. Your shelter doesn't generate protection. It only delays exposure. So now you're inside a system with 3 active threats working simultaneously. Wind is removing heat. Moisture is degrading insulation. And the shelter itself is failing to stabilize either one. At this point, survival stops being about comfort or endurance. It becomes a race between heat loss and your ability to slow it down. Because once your body starts dropping core temperature faster than it can recover it, everything changes. Thinking slows. Movement becomes inefficient. Even small decisions feel heavier than they should. And the worst part is how normal it all feels at first. Nothing screams danger. Nothing breaks dramatically. It's a gradual system collapse happening in silence, which means the real question isn't how cold it is outside. It's how many invisible ways your heat is being taken from you at the same time, without you realizing it. Inside a blizzard, the assumption is simple. Survival depends on expensive gear, insulated tents, or specialized equipment. That assumption collapses fast in real conditions. Here's the thing. Nobody tells you. Most of what keeps heat inside a shelter isn't the tent itself. It's what you build inside and around it. Start with the outer barrier. Wind is the first thing you have to deal with. Not temperature, not snow. Wind strips heat faster than your body can replace it. A thin plastic layer, something as simple as garbage bags or construction plastic, becomes a windbreak, not insulation, just interruption. That alone changes the entire system. But blocking wind is only step one. Inside the shelter, the real shift happens with reflection. Emergency mylar sheets, those thin metallic-looking blankets, don't generate warmth. They redirect it. Body heat doesn't disappear instantly. It radiates outward. Mylar turns that outgoing heat into a loop, bouncing it back toward the body instead of letting it escape into the air. In a controlled setup, it acts less like fabric and more like a heat mirror suspended inside a collapsing environment. Then comes the part most people underestimate: the snow itself. Snow isn't just cold. It's structurally deceptive. It contains millions of trapped air pockets, and trapped air is one of the slowest mediums for heat transfer. When packed into walls around a tent, snow stops behaving like a threat and starts behaving like insulation. A crude barrier, yes, but effective, especially when wind is the primary force trying to tear heat away. So, the system forms in layers. Outer plastic deflects wind. Inner reflective material traps radiated heat. Snow stabilizes the structure and reduces external heat loss. Each layer alone feels insignificant. Combined, they create a microenvironment that slows thermal collapse just enough for the body to maintain equilibrium. And here's the catch most people miss. None of this is about making the space warm. That's the wrong objective. The goal is far more precise. Reduce heat loss below the rate your body can compensate for. A professional setup might cost hundreds or thousands, but in this kind of environment, a few discarded materials can function like a controlled barrier system if arranged correctly. There's an old survival mindset that explains it best. People who've spent winters in improvised shelters don't talk about comfort. They talk about keeping the leak rate low. Every gap, every exposed surface, every airflow path is treated like a failure point. And once you start thinking in those terms, even ordinary objects stop being random trash. They become components of a system that decides whether warmth stays with you long enough for the storm to pass. Inside a blizzard tent, survival is not about staying warm in the way people imagine. It's about slowing down heat loss long enough for your body to keep up. Your body is constantly producing heat, even at rest, but in extreme cold, the environment doesn't just take that heat away. It accelerates the rate of loss until internal balance collapses. The first major force is wind-driven heat stripping. Moving air removes the thin warm layer that naturally forms around your body and shelter surfaces. Without that buffer, every surface becomes exposed to constant cooling. This is why even a small gap in a tent wall can behave like a thermal drain rather than just a hole. Then comes radiant heat loss. Your body constantly emits infrared energy. In open, cold environments, that energy radiates outward into empty space, but certain materials can change that outcome. Reflective surfaces, like thin metallic film layers, redirect a portion of that infrared energy back toward the source. Instead of heat escaping into the environment, some of it is bounced inward, reducing total loss over time. The third mechanism is insulation through trapped air. Air itself is not a strong conductor of heat. The problem is movement. When air is still and trapped in small pockets, it becomes one of the most effective natural insulators available. That is why layered materials, even improvised ones, can outperform thicker single materials. The structure matters more than the substance. Inside a tent during a blizzard, all three processes are happening at once. Heat is being pulled away by wind, radiated outward through surfaces, and conducted into whatever touches your body or the ground. Survival depends on interrupting each of these pathways, just enough to tilt the balance in your favor. The key insight is this: you are not trying to create heat, you are trying to reduce the rate at which you lose it. Even a small improvement in efficiency, slowing loss by 10 to 20%, can be the difference between stabilization and physical collapse over time. The system starts to shift once the initial setup seems to work. At first, everything feels controlled. You've blocked the wind, stacked insulation, and created a small pocket of warmth. But that's exactly where the next problem begins forming. Here's the thing nobody warns you about. Once warm air gets trapped inside a sealed tent, moisture doesn't disappear. It builds, quietly. Every breath you take adds invisible water vapor into the space. Within hours, it condenses on the cold inner surface of the fabric and starts turning into frost. What looked like protection slowly becomes a trap. The same insulation keeping heat in is now holding damp air with nowhere to escape. And when moisture mixes with freezing temperatures, your layers stop behaving like insulation. They start behaving like ice. The real danger isn't the cold outside anymore. It's the system collapsing from inside, where warmth and moisture begin fighting each other in the same confined space. Here's the thing most people miss. Survival in a blizzard isn't one big trick. It's a sequence of small systems that stack on top of each other. If you get the order wrong, nothing works. If you get it right, even weak materials start acting like real protection. Step 1 is wind control, not warmth, not comfort. Wind is the fastest thief of body heat. Every gap in your shelter is a direct exit route for energy. So the first move is always to break airflow before you think about anything else. You don't seal the space perfectly. You disrupt movement. Even uneven barriers or improvised layers are enough if they slow the air down. Step 2 is heat retention. Once wind is reduced, the goal shifts to trapping what your body already produces. This is where reflective surfaces, layered fabrics, and air pockets start to matter. The logic is simple. You're not creating heat, you're recycling it. Every surface inside the shelter becomes part of a loop instead of a loss point. Step 3 is moisture control, but this only works after the first two are stable. Breathing, condensation, and melting snow all add water into the system. And water destroys insulation fast. So the system has to tolerate dampness without collapsing. That means spacing layers so moisture doesn't fully saturate everything at once. The key idea is this: nothing here works alone. Each step protects the next one. Wind protection makes heat retention possible. Heat retention creates condensation risk. Moisture control stabilizes the final structure. This is not gear-dependent thinking. It's sequence-dependent thinking. And once you understand that order, even basic materials start behaving like a structured survival system instead of random improvisation. The storm doesn't ease, it escalates. What started as steady snowfall turns into a violent whiteout, pressing against your tent walls. The fabric bends under sudden wind bursts, snapping and trembling like it's being tested for failure. Inside, the air tightens, heavier. Every breath lingers longer than it should, forming a thin frost along the inner surface of the shelter. At first, it feels like the system is working. Wind is blocked. Heat is partially trapped. Snow walls are holding their shape. Then something changes. Not above you, below you. The cold doesn't just surround you anymore. It begins to pull through the ground itself, silently draining warmth faster than the air outside ever could. Everything you built to survive the storm suddenly feels incomplete, like solving only half the equation. Because the real threat was never just what hit the tent. It's what has been pulling heat out of you the entire time, from beneath your body, without sound, without warning, without pause. Here's the part that quietly decides whether you make it through the night or slowly lose warmth without realizing it. Once wind is reduced and body heat is trapped inside the tent, the next threat isn't in the air anymore. It's beneath you. The frozen ground behaves like a constant heat sink, pulling energy out of your body through direct contact. You don't feel it all at once. It's gradual. That's what makes it dangerous. The system used in extreme conditions isn't about comfort. It's about cutting the chain of heat transfer at the lowest point possible. First layer is separation. Anything dry and insulating creates a break between your body and the ground. It doesn't matter if it looks imperfect. What matters is trapped air. Air is the real barrier, not thickness. Next comes layering strategy. Instead of relying on a single surface, multiple thin layers are stacked with small air gaps in between. Each gap slows down conduction again, forcing heat loss to move through several interruptions instead of one direct path. Then comes compression control. If everything is packed too tightly, the insulation stops working. The system depends on structure, not pressure. Loose, trapped pockets outperform dense padding. In harsher setups, even the base of the tent becomes part of the insulation system, not as protection from wind, but as a buffer zone that reduces direct thermal contact with frozen ground conditions. What makes this critical is simple. Most people assume cold air is the main problem. In reality, the ground is constantly draining heat the entire time you are still. If you don't interrupt that transfer, everything above it becomes less effective, no matter how well it is built. And once you understand that, you realize something important. Survival here isn't about adding warmth. It's about cutting loss at every layer before it reaches your body. Here's the part most people underestimate. The ground is not neutral. It actively pulls heat away from your body like a constant drain. Frozen soil behaves almost like a thermal sink. Once your body heat touches it, energy doesn't just cool down, it is rapidly conducted outward into a much larger mass that never warms up. This is why direct contact with cold ground is far more dangerous than cold air. Air can be slowed with insulation. The ground cannot be stopped, only separated. Even a thin barrier changes everything. Materials that trap air, like cardboard layers, dry debris, or compacted fabric, interrupt conduction by creating microscopic pockets of still air. And still air is a poor conductor, which is exactly what you want. It forces heat to slow down instead of escaping instantly. So the real principle is simple. You are not trying to warm the ground. You are breaking the contact chain between your body and an endless heat sink. In long winters, survival knowledge doesn't come from manuals. It comes from repetition, people learning what fails first, then quietly correcting it night after night. One consistent rule shows up across improvised shelters: never treat the ground as neutral. It is active. It pulls heat away continuously, even when everything above feels stable. That's why experienced survivors instinctively build separation layers without being told. Bags, cardboard-like materials, compressed debris, anything that interrupts direct contact. Another habit is environmental awareness inside the shelter itself. Instead of sealing everything tight, small airflow paths are maintained to prevent moisture from turning into internal frost. It looks counterintuitive, but complete sealing often creates faster collapse than controlled ventilation. Over time, patterns form. What works is not strength, but consistency in small corrections. The system is never perfect. It is constantly adjusted to stop minor losses from becoming total failure. Small adjustments decide whether a shelter holds or collapses under pressure. First rule: moisture control is constant, not occasional. Even in freezing air, breath creates condensation that slowly turns insulation useless. Keep an intentional airflow path near the top of the shelter so vapor escapes instead of freezing into inner surfaces. Second, never let insulation compress fully. Flattened material loses trapped air, and trapped air is the real barrier. Readjust layers every few hours if possible, especially after movement or snowfall buildup. Third, prioritize separation over thickness. A thin, dry barrier between body and frozen surfaces prevents far more heat loss than adding bulk on top. Ground contact is the fastest heat drain in the system. Fourth, use micro shields inside the shelter. Small folded barriers placed near entry points reduce wind infiltration without sealing everything completely. Total sealing creates condensation problems. Finally, think in cycles, not setup. Every hour changes conditions. Wind shifts, moisture rises, and insulation settles. Survival is not building once. It is maintaining balance under constant disruption. At this point, everything comes down to a simple shift in understanding. Survival in a blizzard isn't about fighting the cold directly. It's about controlling what the cold can take from you and how fast it can take it. Wind steals heat. Moisture destroys insulation. Frozen ground pulls energy straight out of your body. Three forces working at once, quietly deciding whether you make it through the night or not. Once you see it clearly, the entire situation stops being random. It becomes a system. If you block wind, slow heat loss, and separate yourself from the ground, you're not enduring the storm anymore. You're managing it. That's the real difference between panic and control. And if you want more breakdowns like this, where real-world survival is stripped down into simple, usable systems, subscribe to the channel. New videos go deeper into how homeless people adapt, improvise, and survive in extreme situations you won't see anywhere else.